Let's talk about a war that was over in a flash, just 4 months, but totally changed the game for the United States. We're diving into the Spanish-American War of 1898. So think about this. How could one single explosion, the sinking of one ship, be the spark that helps create a global empire? It sounds kind of crazy, right? But that's pretty much what happened. This one event triggered a chain reaction that took the US from being a big deal in its own neighborhood to a major player on the world stage. Let's break down how it all went down.
Okay, so before the war even started, things were tense. Super tense. You can think of it like a tinderbox just waiting for a match. You had Spain, an old empire that was kind of on its way out, and the United States, this new, rising power. And right in the middle was Cuba, just a stone's throw from Florida. And that's where everything was about to boil over.
So what was the big deal? Well, it wasn't just one thing, it was a whole mix of things. For starters, a lot of Americans felt really bad for the Cuban people. Spain's rule was harsh, and the Cubans were fighting for their freedom. But, it wasn't just about feelings. There was big money involved. American businesses had a ton invested in Cuban sugar. On top of all that, you had this idea growing in America, this desire to expand and become a bigger world power. And stirring this whole pot? The newspapers, which were publishing some really wild, over-the-top stories.
And that brings us to this key idea, yellow journalism. So what is that? Basically, it's when newspapers care more about selling copies than telling the whole truth. We're talking shocking headlines, dramatic stories, anything to grab your attention. They would really blow up reports about Spanish cruelty in Cuba, and it worked. It got people fired up and demanding that the US government do something.
So you've got all this tension just simmering. It's like a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark came in February 1898. A huge, deadly explosion rocked Havana Harbor.
266. That's how many American sailors lost their lives when the U.S. battleship Maine just blew up and sank. The ship was there to protect American citizens and businesses, and seeing it destroyed like that, it was a massive shock to everyone back in the States.
And almost overnight, a new phrase was on everyone's lips. Remember the Maine. Those same newspapers we talked about, they plastered it everywhere. It became this powerful, emotional rallying cry that basically convinced the entire country that Spain had attacked them. But here's where things get really interesting. Back in 1898, everyone was absolutely convinced that Spain had planted a mine and blown the ship up on purpose. But what do we think today? Well, modern experts believe it was probably an accident, a fire in the ship's coal storage that set off the ammunition. But you know what? At the time, the actual facts didn't really matter. The story was just too powerful. The public was outraged, and the country was heading straight for war. So, in April of '98, it's official. We're at war. Now, most Americans probably thought, okay, this is about Cuba. But the U.S. government had much, much bigger plans. This wasn't just going to be a Caribbean conflict. No, this was going to be a war on two fronts, targeting Spanish territories all the way across the Pacific. And boom, the first big punch is thrown. But it's not in Cuba. It's halfway around the world in the Philippines. An American fleet sails into Manila Bay and just annihilates the Spanish fleet there. I mean, get this. The U.S. didn't lose a single ship. Not one American died in combat. It was a jaw-dropping, one-sided victory that suddenly put the U.S. in control of the Philippines and showed the world that the American Navy was for real.
Okay, so the Navy is having this incredible success. But the fight on the ground in Cuba, that was a totally different story. It was brutal. The soldiers were dealing with insane tropical heat, diseases like yellow fever that they had no defense against, and get this, they were wearing heavy wool uniforms. In the Caribbean, they were short on food, medicine, you name it. It was a really, really tough situation.
But even in these tough conditions, you get some incredible stories. The most famous group to come out of this war was probably the Rough Riders. This was a volunteer unit, and it was this wild mix of people. You had cowboys, Ivy League athletes, sheriffs, a real grab bag. And who was leading them? A guy you might have heard of, Theodore Roosevelt. He was this larger-than-life character, and this war would make him a national hero.
Their big moment came at the Battle of San Juan Hill. This was the bloodiest, most intense land battle of the whole war. And the Rough Riders weren't alone. They fought alongside seasoned African-American troops, the Buffalo Soldiers. Together, they charged up and captured these critical hills, and that was it. That was the move that basically won the fight for Cuba.
So now, the Americans are on the high ground looking down, and the Spanish fleet is stuck in the harbor below. They had to make a run for it. It was a desperate gamble, and it failed spectacularly. The U.S. Navy was waiting for them and, just like in the Philippines, destroyed their entire fleet. Checkmate. The fight for Cuba was effectively over.
With their navy at the bottom of the sea in both the Pacific and the Caribbean, Spain knew it was over. They couldn't win. So in August, they agreed to an armistice. Now, an armistice isn't a peace treaty. It's more like a timeout. It's an agreement to stop all the fighting so the diplomats can sit down and figure out the terms of surrender.
And where did they meet to hammer out those details? Paris. The agreement they came up with, the Treaty of Paris, would make it all official and literally redraw the world map.
So here's what the deal looked like. Spain had to give up any claim to Cuba. Cuba was now independent. Then, Spain handed over Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States. And then came the really big one. Spain sold the Philippines to the U.S. for $20 million. This was a huge deal and pretty controversial. In the blink of an eye, the old Spanish Empire was crumbling, and an American one was being born.
You know, some people at the time called this a splendid little war. I guess because it was quick, and the U.S. won so decisively. But little? Its consequences were anything but. They were massive, and they would echo for the next 100 years.
And the aftermath was complicated. Take Cuba. It got its independence, technically, but the U.S. still had a lot of say in what happened there. But the Philippines? That's a different story. The Filipino people had fought with the Americans against Spain, thinking they were fighting for their own freedom. So you can imagine their shock when they found out they just swapped one colonial power for another. This kicked off a whole new war, one that was much longer and deadlier, this time between the Philippines and the United States.
Back in the U.S., this short war changed everything. Suddenly, America wasn't just a regional player, it was a world power with an empire. This started a huge debate at home. Should a country that was founded on the idea of freedom be ruling over other people? On the other hand, fighting a common enemy did help unite the country a bit after the Civil War, and it was a wake-up call that the military desperately needed to modernize its gear and its training.
So, in the end, the war was over in just about 4 months, but it put the United States on a completely new path, a path where it would be a major force all over the planet. And that leaves us with a pretty big question, one that's still relevant today. What's the true price of becoming a global power?